Picture Rome in the 1st century before Christ, the beating heart of the ancient world, streets crowded with merchants shouting their wares, children running between columns, slaves carrying amphorae of wine, senators gliding past in their togas. But above all of this noise, there was one sound that could turn joy into terror within moments: the crackle of fire. Rome was not a city of marble, despite what poets like to say. Most of it was built of wood, insulae, tall apartment blocks stacked like towers of tinder, streets so narrow that wagons barely squeezed through, lamps burning with open flames, kitchens cooking with wood and oil. The city was a giant bonfire waiting for a spark, and sparks were plentiful. A single candle tipped over, a cooking pot spilling oil, a careless torch carried through the streets. Within minutes, flames leapt from roof to roof, choking smoke filled the alleys. Families scrambled for their lives, and what began as one mistake became a catastrophe. Entire blocks reduced to ash, and in a city with no organized fire department. There was little hope, but in the midst of this chaos there was one man who saw fire not as danger, but as opportunity. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who would become the richest Roman of his age, a man whose name even today is whispered alongside greed itself. While others fled fire, Crassus followed it. And where people saw destruction, he saw profit. He created his own fire brigades, hundreds of slaves trained not just with buckets and hooks, but with negotiation. Their orders were simple: do not fight the flames until their master gives the word. Crassus himself would appear at the burning site, calm, collected, his toga spotless even as ashes filled the air, and he would make his offer: sell me your property now, for a fraction of its worth, and I will save it. Refuse me, and I will watch it burn. Imagine the desperation. A man with his wife and children screaming beside him, his life's work about to turn to cinders, and before him stands Crassus, the only man with the power to save it, but demanding he surrender everything for almost nothing. It was extortion dressed as salvation. It was business built on tragedy, and the people sold. Of course they sold. What good was pride when flames licked at your walls, when the heat seared your skin, when the neighbors screamed for water? The contracts were signed, the deeds transferred, and then, only then, would Crassus snap his fingers, and his brigades would rush in, dousing the flames, tearing down walls to block the fire's spread, saving what was now no longer theirs, but his. Street by street, block by block, he devoured Rome, buying prime land at fire sale prices, rebuilding it, renting it, selling it, turning every disaster into empire. By the end of his life, he owned much of Rome's real estate. He had turned ashes into gold. He had transformed catastrophe into fortune. This was the scam of Marcus Licinius Crassus, not theft in the night, not fraud in secret, but extortion in daylight. A scam so bold it could only succeed in plain sight. And succeed it did, building him a fortune so vast that even emperors envied it. And history remembers him as the Fire King of Rome. To understand Crassus, we must step back into the violent, shifting world of late Republican Rome. This was not a stable empire of emperors yet. It was a republic tearing itself apart. Civil wars raged, generals turned their armies against one another, and fortunes rose and fell overnight. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born into privilege. His father had been consul, one of the highest offices in the Roman Republic. The Crassi family held wealth, land, and status. But when civil war erupted between the supporters of Marius and those of Sulla, his father was accused of siding with the wrong faction, hunted, and eventually killed. The family's estates were confiscated, their fortunes shattered. Young Crassus learned early that Rome was not a place of stability. It was a place where one could lose everything in a heartbeat. But while others might have crumbled under such loss, Crassus adapted. He hid in exile in Spain during the worst of the civil wars, studying rhetoric, sharpening his mind, and watching carefully how power truly worked in Rome. He saw that laws were fragile, that loyalty was negotiable, that wealth was not just protection, but a weapon. When Sulla marched on Rome and seized control, Crassus returned, aligning himself with the victorious dictator. Here, his fortunes began to turn. Sulla launched massive proscriptions, a campaign where the property of enemies of the state was seized, their names posted publicly, their wealth auctioned off. It was a time of blood and gold, thousands executed, estates sold for pennies, and Crassus positioned himself to profit. He bought confiscated properties at absurdly low prices, sometimes through proxies, sometimes directly, accumulating land and wealth once again. But it was not enough. The fires of Rome gave him the chance to do more than recover. They gave him a system, a machine of profit that others feared to even imagine. He created what was essentially one of the first private monopolies in urban property, not by building, not by innovating, but by exploiting tragedy. Consider this. Rome had no official firefighting force, no public institution to protect citizens from the most common disaster of their lives. The state failed, and into that vacuum stepped Crassus. He turned public neglect into private empire. He trained hundreds of slaves, not only in firefighting, but in negotiation and intimidation. Some carried axes, others carried contracts, one to tear down walls, the other to tear down pride. When flames erupted, the spectacle itself became theater. Neighbors gathered in horror, smoke billowed across the city. And then came Crassus's men, not rushing in, not desperate to save, but standing, waiting, buckets in hand but motionless. Until the deal was struck, the crowd would watch as bargaining unfolded. Lives weighed against profit, and when finally the owner surrendered, the brigade would act. The drama complete. This was extortion institutionalized. It was disaster capitalism, in its rawest form, but in a city desperate for solutions, people had no choice. Crassus became not only wealthy but feared. His name whispered in every alley. His presence dreaded at every fire, yet admired too. For in Rome, cunning was often praised as much as honor, and this was only one of his many schemes. His fortune expanded through silver mines in Spain, through slave trading, through lending money at interest to desperate aristocrats. Through every channel where others saw risk, he saw advantage. His real estate empire became so vast that entire districts of Rome were effectively his. But the fire scam remained the most infamous, the clearest picture of his mind. A man who had once lost everything to flames of civil war, now building everything by controlling flames in the streets. Crassus was not only exploiting houses, he was exploiting psychology. He understood fear. He knew that in the moment of panic, humans will give up everything, pride, wealth, even dignity, just for a chance to save what little remains. This is what makes him one of history's greatest scammers. He did not steal in shadows. He created a system where victims willingly signed away their fortunes, where society itself accepted his role, where power and greed fused into one. By the time he allied himself with Caesar and Pompey in the first triumvirate, he was already legendary, not just for wealth but for the way he had earned it, through fire, through fear, through a scam that burned itself into history. Now let us slow down and look closely at how Crassus's infamous firefighting scam actually worked. For this was not chaos. This was not random greed. It was a carefully crafted system, as organized as any business in Rome. Imagine you are a Roman shopkeeper. Your insula, your apartment block, stands tall but fragile, built of wood, tar, and stone. One night, a fire breaks out in the bakery across the alley. Flames leap across rooftops. Neighbors shout. Smoke pours into the streets. Panic spreads. You rush outside. Your wife clutches the children. You scream for help. But Rome has no fire brigade, no city guards trained for such a disaster. Then, through the smoke, Crassus's men appear, not rushing, not desperate but deliberate, carrying buckets, hooks, ladders, axes. Their faces calm, trained, their bodies disciplined. They form a line, but they do not move. They do not throw a single drop of water. Instead, one of Crassus's agents approaches you, a tablet in his hand. "A contract ready," he says in a steady voice. "The master will buy this property now for half its worth, perhaps less. Sign here and the flames will stop. Refuse and the flames will consume." The negotiation is cruel theater, the fire raging behind you, your family screaming beside you, the agent unflinching. Before you, neighbors watching around you, shame mixing with terror. You hesitate. You plead. Perhaps you even curse Crassus's name, but the fire does not wait. The walls tremble, the heat grows, and in the end, you break. You sign, and with that signature, everything you owned is gone. The moment the ink dries, Crassus gives the signal. His men spring to life. A machine suddenly, in motion, they form chains, passing buckets hand to hand, tearing down walls to block the spread, pouring water with precision. Soon the flames die. Smoke rises into the night. Your house is saved, but it is no longer yours. It belongs to Crassus. This was not a single event. This was repeated countless times across neighborhoods, across years. Crassus's brigades became a familiar sight. Their stillness as frightening as the fire itself. People came to know if Crassus arrived, their choice was not between fire and safety. It was between fire and surrender. Through this system, Crassus built a real estate monopoly. He bought prime land in Rome at desperate prices, rebuilt it with his vast slave workforce, and rented it back to citizens. Imagine the irony. Families who once owned their homes now paid Crassus rent to live in the same place. His wealth multiplied not just through acquisition, but through the endless cycle of tragedy turned into income. And Rome itself was complicit. There was no law to stop him, no state fire brigade to replace him. Senators muttered but admired his cunning. Citizens cursed him but still depended on him. He thrived because he exposed the weaknesses of the system, turning public failure into private fortune. Politically, this wealth gave him power. He funded politicians, bought influence, and eventually partnered with Julius Caesar and Pompey, forming the first triumvirate, a trio that would dominate Roman politics. But unlike Caesar, who sought glory, unlike Pompey, who sought conquest, Crassus sought gold. His fire scam had taught him that wealth was the true engine of power. That, with enough silver, enough land, enough slaves, even generals and senators bowed. Psychologically, his scam left scars. People lived in fear not only of fire, but of Crassus himself. He became a symbol of greed so brazen, it almost commanded respect. Even Cicero, Rome's sharp-tongued orator, acknowledged Crassus's unmatched wealth, but hinted at the shameful ways it was earned. Yet Crassus did not care. For in Rome, success excused everything. Here we see one of history's darkest truths. A scam does not need to be hidden to succeed. Sometimes it thrives in the open because victims are too desperate to resist, because the system itself allows it, because society admires the cleverness of the scammer more than the suffering of the scammed. Crassus understood this, and it made him unstoppable. Now, if the fire scam built Crassus's fortune, his slave empire expanded it into something colossal. For Rome was a slave society. Conquered peoples were sold like cattle. Entire villages could be auctioned off in a single day. And Crassus saw in this human misery not just labor, but profit. He bought slaves in bulk, not just any slaves, but skilled workers, stonemasons, builders, architects, even scribes. He understood that a single trained builder could create 10 times more value than a farmhand. So he scoured markets for those with talent, his eyes sharp, his money endless, and soon he owned thousands. These slaves became the lifeblood of his real estate empire. When he bought a fire-damaged house, his own teams of slaves rebuilt it. No need to pay contractors, no need to hire labor. Every brick laid, Every wall raised, every fresco painted, was done by men who belonged to him. Their suffering was his profit. Their skill was his ladder to power. But Crassus did not stop there. He turned his gaze underground, to the silver mines of Spain and beyond, mines notorious for their brutality, where men toiled in darkness, breathing dust, chained to pickaxes. Many never saw daylight again. The mines consumed lives, but produced endless streams of silver, and Crassus invested heavily. In this too, his methods echoed a scam. He bought exhausted mines cheaply, mines others thought worthless, then used his vast slave workforce to squeeze out what little remained. The profit margins were staggering, because for him, labor cost nothing. Human lives were expendable. He turned rusted tunnels into rivers of coin, step by step, scam by scam. He built an empire so vast that even senators whispered his name with envy. Estimates suggest his wealth reached 200 million sesterces, perhaps more, an amount unimaginable to ordinary Romans. It was said that no man in Rome could compete with his riches, and he carried this wealth like a weapon, sharper than any sword. Yet wealth alone was not the end, for in Rome, wealth was power, and power demanded to be displayed. Crassus financed political campaigns, bribed juries, controlled votes, and positioned himself beside giants like Pompey and Caesar. But he never forgot that his foundation, his first great fortune, had come not from conquest, but from fire and fear. What then was the impact on Rome, beyond the walls of his estates, beyond the silver in his vaults? It was a city reshaped by greed. Citizens who once owned homes found themselves tenants. Entire neighborhoods bore the stamp of Crassus's rebuilding. The very skyline of Rome became a monument to exploitation, and socially, something darker lingered. Romans admired cunning, they respected ambition, but they also whispered of corruption. Crassus's name became a symbol. To some, he was a genius, to others, a vulture. Even within the Senate, his methods stirred unease, yet none dared openly challenge him. For in Rome, as in all empires, money silenced outrage. Philosophically, his story reveals a timeless truth. Scams flourish not because people are foolish, but because systems are weak. The state had no fire brigade, so Crassus became the fire brigade. The state could not control the mines, so Crassus became the master of the mines. Where there was a void, he filled it, and he charged a price. And if we look closely, do we not see echoes of this in our own age? Billionaires who build monopolies from crises, corporations that profit from disasters, landlords who grow rich as tenants struggle. The logic is the same. The tools have changed, but the structure remains. Wealth born from weakness, power born from suffering. In the end, Crassus was not merely a man of Rome. He was a mirror of Rome. Ruthless, ambitious, exploitative, relentless. His scams were Rome's flaws magnified. His fortune was Rome's failure measured in coin, and his shadow stretched far, for even in his death, when he sought glory in Parthia and perished, his legend survived, not as a hero, not as a conqueror, but as the man who turned fire into gold, who turned crisis into empire. This is why Marcus Licinius Crassus stands among the greatest scammers of history. Not because he tricked men with illusions, but because he tricked a society into accepting his greed as brilliance. And by the time Rome realized the cost, it was already too late. Rome feared many enemies: barbarian tribes across the Rhine, pirates in the Mediterranean, rival empires in the East. But perhaps its most terrifying enemy of all came not from outside its borders, but from within, from the chains of its own slaves. In the year 73 BCE, a gladiator named Spartacus broke free from a training school in Capua, along with 70 others, armed with nothing but kitchen knives and desperation. What began as a prison break turned into one of the greatest slave revolts in history. Soon tens of thousands of men and women, slaves of every background, joined his cause, their numbers swelling, their rage uncontrollable. Rome panicked. Legions were sent, and legions were destroyed. Spartacus and his rebel army crushed force after force, humiliating the Republic. Senators trembled. Aristocrats feared their villas would burn, their estates overrun. And it was then that Marcus Licinius Crassus, already wealthy beyond imagination, stepped forward, offering his fortune and his ambition. To end the revolt, why, one might ask, would Crassus, the master of slaves, take such a risk? The answer lies in his hunger for power, for glory. He knew Pompey, his rival, was winning victories in Spain. He knew Caesar, though young, was rising fast. He needed a stage to prove himself not just rich, but indispensable. Crassus took command of massive forces, 6 legions, and in his style, he ruled with ruthless discipline. When his men faltered, he revived the ancient punishment of decimation. Every 10th soldier executed by his own comrades, a brutal terror tactic that forged his legions into iron. Fear was his weapon, just as it had been in the burning streets of Rome. The campaign against Spartacus was long and bloody. Battles fought across the Italian peninsula. The slaves fought not merely for freedom, but for survival. And though many escaped, many were slaughtered. Finally, in 71 BCE, Crassus cornered Spartacus in southern Italy. The final clash was brutal. Spartacus himself was said to have died fighting like a lion, refusing to flee, refusing to surrender. The rebellion was crushed, but Crassus did not stop with victory. He ordered 6,000 captured slaves crucified along the Appian Way, the main road into Rome, their bodies hanging for miles, a grotesque warning, a spectacle of terror. Rome's citizens walked past the dying and the dead, reminded of the power of the state, reminded of the cruelty of the masters. And here lies the great irony. Crassus, who had built his fortune on slaves, who had turned human beings into profit machines, became the man who destroyed the greatest slave rebellion of all. He killed Spartacus, but in truth, Spartacus haunted him, for his wealth and his empire were built on the very foundation that Spartacus had sought to shatter. Politically, this victory gave Crassus leverage. He stood now as a savior of Rome, yet even here, he was scammed. For Pompey, returning from Spain, intercepted fleeing rebels, slaughtered them, and then claimed he had ended the war. The Senate, eager to balance rival egos, awarded Pompey more glory, more credit, and Crassus, though victorious, tasted humiliation. It is almost poetic. The man who mastered scams, who tricked Rome with fire and fortune, was himself tricked by the politics of power. He wanted to be Rome's greatest general, but he remained Rome's richest man, respected, feared, but never loved, admired for his wealth, despised for his methods, trapped in a cycle of ambition he could never fully escape. And the lesson, if we step back, is striking. Scams thrive not only in markets, not only in streets, but in politics. Reputations can be stolen as easily as houses. Credit can be seized as easily as silver. Crassus, who robbed others of dignity, was himself robbed of glory. The story of Spartacus and Crassus is not just a clash of swords, it is a clash of ideals, freedom versus greed, courage versus exploitation. And though Spartacus was crucified, his name endured, while Crassus, despite his mountains of gold, remains remembered most of all as a man who profited from tragedy, and who, in the end, was outmaneuvered by rivals who understood that sometimes the greatest scam of all is politics itself. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the man who had survived Sulla's bloody proscriptions, the man who had built empires out of fire and ash, the man who had crushed Spartacus and crucified thousands, was not satisfied. Wealth had made him powerful, Politics had made him influential, but in Rome, true immortality belonged to conquerors, generals whose victories stretched the empire's borders. Pompey had Spain in the east, Caesar had Gaul, but Crassus had gold, and to him it was not enough. He dreamed of glory, he hungered for a triumph, a parade through Rome's streets where he could be crowned in laurel, cheered by the people not just as rich, but as great. And so he turned his gaze eastward toward Parthia, a mighty empire of horse archers, desert kings, and legendary wealth. If he could conquer Parthia, he believed, his name would shine as bright as Caesar's. His legacy would be unshakable. But fortune, the goddess he had worshipped all his life, betrayed him. Or perhaps she finally demanded her price. In 53 BCE, Crassus led 7 legions, more than 40,000 men, across the Euphrates, his soldiers weary, his officers uneasy. Many warned him, Parthia was not Gaul, not Spain. It was a land of vast plains, endless sun, and armies that fought with speed and deception. But Crassus, blinded by ambition, pressed on. The decisive battle came at Carrhae, a name that would become Rome's shame. The Parthians, led by General Surena, unleashed waves of horse archers. Their arrows darkened the sky, their cataphracts, armored cavalry, charged with thunder. The Romans, trapped in open ground, were slaughtered. Crassus, the man who had burned houses to seize them, who had bought up corpses of estates, who had squeezed silver from dying miners, found himself surrounded, his legions shattered, his son Publius dead, his army broken. The Parthians, mocking him, offered negotiations. Some say they tricked him with false promises of peace. Others say he went willingly, desperate to salvage honor. But what followed became legend. One account says he was seized, mocked, and killed. Another, more famous, says molten gold was poured down his throat. A cruel irony. The man who worshipped wealth, who built his life on the lust for coin, choked on the very symbol of his greed, whether fact or fiction. The tale endures because it captures what words alone cannot. Crassus died as he lived, consumed. By gold, his body was desecrated, his head and hands sent to Parthian kings, later displayed in plays mocking Rome, a final humiliation for a man who had once owned half the city. His wealth could not save him. His fire brigades could not rescue him. His slaves could not rebuild his honor. His silver could not bribe death. And Rome? How did Rome react? The Senate mourned the defeat. Legions were lost, honor shattered. The balance of power tilted. Pompey and Caesar grew stronger. Civil war loomed, and Crassus, who had dreamed of being the equal of those giants, was erased from the game. But his story did not vanish. It became a cautionary tale, whispered in forums, debated by historians, retold for centuries. Marcus Licinius Crassus, richest man in Rome, died not as a conqueror, but as a warning. What do we learn? Wealth without restraint is a fire. It consumes not only others, but the one who wields it. Scams may build empires, but they leave cracks, weaknesses that time will expose. Greed may seem endless, but it always has a cost. Look closely, and you see the timelessness. Modern billionaires chasing endless growth, corporations consuming resources until collapse, leaders blinded by their own ambition. Crassus lives on, not in marble statues or glorious histories, but in the pattern of greed that repeats again and again. And so chapter 1 closes. The tale of a man who scammed a city, who turned fire into fortune, who rose higher than almost any Roman, but who fell, choking on the weight of his own desire. A man remembered not as Rome's greatest hero, but as Rome's greatest vulture. As we turn to the next chapter, keep this in mind. Scams in history are not just tricks. They are mirrors. They reveal the flaws of their age and the cracks in our own.